Hey, this is Tom from MVP Chess. Welcome back to my series on Bobby Fischer's seminal work, My 60 Memorable Games. In this video, we'll be analyzing game number 47 that Fischer played versus Arthur Bisguier in the 63-64 U.S. Championship. You're not going to want to miss Fischer put on another clinic in the Ruy Lopez. Before we jump in, don't forget to smash that subscribe button and join Team MVP. Thank you so much for your support. So this is the second game that we've seen versus Arthur Bisguier. The first came in game 45 when the two faced off in the New York State Championship. Here, they're playing in the USA Championship. Now, Bisguier was a very strong player, grandmaster, but against Fischer, unfortunately, he had a dreadful score. He was really Fischer's punching bag throughout his entire career. This game's no exception. Fischer with the white pieces plays e4, best by test, of course. We have e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. Bisguier goes for a6, Morphy's defense. Fischer backs the bishop up, and after knight f6, castles. Bishop e7, Fischer plays rook e1. Okay, now that white's pawn on e4 is defended, white is threatening. Bishop takes c6, followed by knight takes e5. So that's why in this position, Bisguier plays b5, driving back the bishop, castles, and c3. Now, Fischer is inviting Bisguier to play the so-called Marshall attack against the Ruy Lopez. This is a very dangerous weapon at Black's disposal in the Ruy Lopez. Of course, it was first famously employed by Frank Marshall against Jose Ruel Capablanca, who had this opening novelty cooked up and waited, I think, over 10 years to play it against Capablanca. But, of course, the human chess machine in that game managed to refute the opening over the board. But let's just take a look. After d5, this would be the start of the Marshall attack. And notice Black does go down a pawn, but after c6, d4, and bishop d6, usually the rook comes back to e1. Black can play queen h4, and after g3, queen h3, this is kind of the tabia of the Marshall attack. And you see Black for the sacrifice pawn has a massive lead in development and great play against White's king. But Fischer didn't go for this line. Bisguier didn't go for this line because he transposed back into a closed variation of the Spanish with d6. Pawn h3, knight a5, bishop c2, and c5. So now we're back in more traditional Chigorin variation waters. Fischer expands in the center. Queen c7, knight bd2. The knight comes back to c6. Bisguier looking to improve this problem piece for Black in the open games, this queen's knight. Now, Fischer makes a really interesting decision here. He gives away the center by playing d takes c5, followed by knight f1. And he states that his idea is to give up the center, but to try to play against the weak squares on d5 and f5, particularly with his knights. So Bisguier brings the rook to the d file with gain of tempo. Fischer brings the queen to safety on e2. Knight h5. Bisguier looking to abuse the potentially weakened f4 square. But Fischer is able to play g3. Nice calculation by Fischer, okay? It looks like this move is not possible because it hangs the h3 pawn. In the game, Bisguier played g6 defending the knight. Let's just take a look at what would happen if Bisguier went pawn grabbing and played bishop takes h3. Well, then after knight g5, Black's position on the king side is just too loose. This knight is hit, the bishop's hit. After bishop takes f1, queen takes h5, threatening devastation on the king side. Black would be forced to capture. And then Fischer, after f6, let's say, would have a nice desperado here. Bishop takes f6, where the bishop on f1 is still hanging. So this line would definitely be bad news for Black. So Bisguier alertly avoids going in for this. Fischer now saves the pawn on h3 by advancing to h4. Bishop e6, knight e3. So Fischer, with a classic Spanish maneuver, routing this queen's knight over to greener pastures on the king side in the center, and he's looking to land his pony on the d5 square. After pawn to f6, preventing the knight from landing on g5, Fischer brings the queen's knight to d5. And Bisguier, since his pieces are forked, drops the queen back to b7. Now, you might be wondering, what happens if black captures here and wins a pawn? This is exactly what Fischer wants. After pawn to a4, okay, really undermining black's entire structure on the queen side, Bisguier would have a critically weak a2 to g8 diagonal. Fischer would have the bishop pair, safer king, and all the chances in this position. That's why he played queen b7. But this allows Fischer to grab the bishop pair, which he coined winning the minor exchange. So Fischer has his two bishops. He loved his two bishops, so I'm sure he was feeling really good about his position as of move 20. Here's a really instructive move by Fischer. Okay, this knight on f3, okay, is really hemmed in by black's pawns. The d4 square is not available. Neither is the g5 square. So Fischer identifies this as his worst placed piece and looks to improve it. And he does so with a step back boogie by the knight h2. Okay, so the knight's eyeing the d5 square, just like its brother did, and has two routes here. He can go g4, e3 into d5, or all the way back to f1, e3 to d5. Sometimes to improve your knights, you have to retreat them, okay, in order to bring them forward. So Fischer, nice maneuver to improve this knight. After knight g7, knight g4, pawn to c4, queen to f3. Fischer is threatening this maneuver when the queen on f3 would nicely support the knight coming to d5. So Bisguier says, you know what, I better go ahead and exchange off that bishop. And now Fischer has won the minor exchange again. He has two bishops, the bishop pair, against two knights. In Fischer's hand, this material imbalance was basically decisive. Knight e6 from Bisguier trying to activate his knights. Pawn to h5, Fischer looks to continue attacking on the king side, probing for more weaknesses in black's king position. Bisguier gets off this potentially dangerous g-file, and Fischer plays king g2 here, okay? Perhaps menacing rook h1, activating the rook along the h-file, which provokes Bisguier into playing g5 to close things down. So Fischer gets on with his development, bishop e3. Notice it's move 27, and Fischer is now just developing his queen's bishop. This is very common in the Ruy Lopez. Very often this bishop can influence the game just as much on c1 as it can developing it to either e3 or g5. So very often it's worth waiting to see how things play out before you develop this piece in Spanish. And to get this rook into the game, you can look to play pawn to a4. So that's just a positional tip for you Spanish players out there. Bisguier comes up with a really nice move in this position, knight f4. Okay, eyeballing this really attractive square on d3. If the pony lands there, it's going to change from a knight into an octopus. Notice Fischer would be best advised not to capture this piece because after g takes, the bishop on e3 is attacked, and black would also be menacing rook g8, skewering the queen. So this knight on f4 is untouchable, so Fischer sidesteps his king to h2. And the pony has landed on d3. Now, you can see why a knight, misfire there, on the 6th rank is called an octopus. It is just reaching its tentacles all over the board, okay, controlling key squares in the center of the board, attacking key squares in white's position. Of course, Fischer cannot let this piece stay on the board. He captures on d3 immediately. But he's gained something in return. So Fischer has relinquished his bishop pair. He no longer has a pair of bishops, but he traded one advantage, i.e. the bishop pair, for another. Now he's got a really weak pawn on d3 that he can target. And to make matters worse for Bisguier, this weak pawn is on a half-open file, so Fischer can really look to coordinate his heavy pieces and try to win this pawn. That's exactly what he does. Rook ed1, rook d7, and rook d2. Fischer getting ready to bring the other rook and to scoop up this pawn. We have knight a5. Fischer plays a nice prophylactic move here, pawn to b3, shutting down any notion of knight c4. Queen d6, and of course Fischer brings his other rook into the attack. This pawn is a goner. Notice Bisguier does not have great coordination on the d file to defend this pawn. Okay, he'd much rather his queen, not be leading this defensive effort because he's not going to be able to recapture. We have rook e8, and after rook takes d3, queen takes d3. I will turn it over to you in this position. After Fischer's next move, Bisguier resigned. So pause your videos and have a think. What did Fischer play here? So there's more than one winning move in this position. Rook takes d3, although it would be winning, kind of misses the mark, at least in my opinion and in Fischer's, because it does relinquish control over the only open file to black. Okay, and this in the long run might be difficult for Fischer to break down. Okay, he was looking for something much cleaner. So congratulations if you found the nice X-ray tactic. Queen takes d7. Boom. Great move by Fischer, and this prompt resignation from Bisguier. So the tactical idea being, of course, once the queen recaptures, the rook lands on d7. So Fischer would be playing without his queen, but in this position, he has more control. Okay, notice Fischer is the one who controls the only open file on the board. Okay, and after a line he gives rook e6 and king h3, okay, notice all of these weak squares on black's king side, you know, especially the advanced g5, that really left a lot of weaknesses in its wake. So Fischer has a really clear plan to improve his king's activity. He's going to bring this king to f5, and black would be absolutely done for in this position. So let's leave the final move on the board. Queen takes d7. Great move, great ending by Fischer. Of course, this game, like the previous one we saw against Benko, came in the 63-64 U.S. Chess Championship, a tournament in which Fischer finished 11-0. This is the only time in United States Chess Championship history that somebody has gone 11-0. This was really Fischer coming into his own, the height of his powers, and really there wasn't a player on the planet at this point that was really any match for him, perhaps except for himself. So I really hope you enjoyed this analysis. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button and join Team MVP. You're not going to want to miss my next installment, which will be game number 48. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. I'll see you soon. Bye.